All right. So welcome everybody to our second installment of the Hague program on cybersecurity online seminars for fall 2025. My name's Julia Carver. I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Hague program, and I'm very pleased today to welcome Professor Jon R. Lindsay, who will be speaking on his new book, The Age of Deception. Um, and Cybersecurity as Secret Statecraft. And Professor Lindsay is an associate professor at the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And he's authored a number of publications by which I'm sure you're all very familiar of, and we're really excited to have him here today at this early hour as well in the US. So thank you again, Professor Lindsay, for joining us. And just to set some ground rules for our seminars, as normal, we will first hear some remarks from Professor Lindsay, and then we will move into the Q&A. So either please raise your virtual hand or put your question in the chat. And I know Professor Lindsay is keen to have some audience engagement. So also, if you'd like to take questions throughout, it's totally up to you, Professor Lindsay.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much, Julia, for that kind introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's really a delight to be speaking to this audience on this particular book, because I think it was back in 2021 that Dennis, and I see Dennis is there on the list. Dennis Broders invited me to join a seminar, and it was down at the PTT building in town. And we were all just coming out of the pandemic, so still wearing our masks. It was the first time we had seen each other for a year and a half. And Dennis invited me to give this keynote, and it was the first time that I talked in public about the organization of this book and the ideas that finally come to be. So it's really, really great to sort of come full circle with this audience. And when I was there, I put up a picture from Escher of his Metamorphosis, one of his Metamorphosis prints, because this is what this book is about. It's the metamorphosis of secret statecraft, which has been around for thousands of years, into something different in cyberspace. So the book itself actually, oops, let's see if it comes back. Yeah, Age of Deception, right? So it's got, I think that was backwards on Zoom, but you're all familiar in this audience with Escher's Eye, right? It hangs on the wall at the Escher Museum, and it is just this wonderful, wonderful print. And when I saw it, I knew it had to be on this book. One, because it was a nice callback to the first time that this book was presented. And the other thing is that Escher's Eye really just captures the themes of using the instrument of perception and information, but being worried about this problem that lurks within. And there's also this incredible, set of paradoxes in all of Escher's work, but certainly in that one where it's, Escher looking into a shaving mirror, and he is drawing his own eye, and he's put the skull in the middle of his eye. But now you're standing there in his place, and Escher is gone, and so you're wondering, am I looking at my own mortality or his? And you've got this circle of reflections, and that's important because you've got paradoxes that run throughout this book. So I was really delighted that came together. Also, the picture kind of gave the book this old-timey feel. And one thing I was adamant about with Cornell is that this book not have any microchips or ones and zeros or glowing globes or hackers with hoodies. I said, yes, this is a book about cyberspace, but I really want it to be calling back to the more classic problems. And so, I wanted the book to kind of look like, more of an old-timey philosophy book. So I'm happy with the way that came out. Now, by way of some more background, that book kind of grew out of this other one, Information Technology and Military Power, which came out in 2020. And that was actually based on my dissertation way back in the MIT days. But when I was a postdoc, I thought I was going to work on Chinese military power. That's why I took this postdoc. And that was in 2012, 2013. And that's when Chinese cyber espionage against corporations and organizations around the world really, really started to get a lot of attention in the media. My colleagues at UCSD looked at me and they said, well, Jon, you know information technology and you're an IR, so tell us about China and cyber. So I kind of retooled from a military power person to study cyber, and that led to a lot of publications that I wanted to bring together. So when I wrote the book, Information Technology and Military Power, right, it had no cyber in it, right? Which may seem a little bit strange. Cyber is everywhere in modern military power, and military organizations are obsessed with cyber warfare. And here was a book ostensibly about that didn't mention it at all. So clearly I needed to get around to it. But one of and there was a chapter in there that I ripped out. It eventually became a paper on the political economy of cybersecurity, which is now chapter 3 in the new book. And I just mention that because, some of you are writing or have written books, and that, your imagination of the book is often a little different, and they grow and they come back and they finally find their scope. So I had to pull all the cyber out, and it eventually became this new project. And that was important because, cybersecurity and cyberspace is so much about the civilian realm. Right? You're dealing with a space that is largely built by civilian corporations for economic purposes. It's owned and operated by, if not commercial entities, but at least the civilian parts of government. So this is very much not a military domain, even though it is exploited by that. We can even talk about that funny word domain if you want to, which I think is a silly word, but now inevitable. Um, so it had to be a different book, and I'm glad that it is. Okay. One thing, since we're still kind of in nostalgia mode here, one of the things that it shares with that previous book is a really strong focus on institutions and ideas of political economy. And in that first book, right, I tried to make the argument that um, uh, military knowledge and knowledge in general really depends on institutions, right? We at least need a common language. We need common protocols if we are interacting through technological systems. We need to be able to understand how we represent things, right? Why is it that we represent a traffic jam with a red line or a black line on our Google rather than something else, right? We have common knowledge about this, okay? So the very ability to look at the world and understand the world relies on institutional constraints and common knowledge. And that's a really, really hard problem in war, because war is about breaking institutions, right? War is what happens when people don't have common knowledge and you have organizations that are fighting each other. Okay, all of this mania for thinking about information technology will lift the fog of war, right? It runs up against this fundamental structural problem that knowledge and information depends on institutions, and yet fighting and conflict, right, happen in this more anarchic environment. So there's this fundamental tension there. And so I used concepts from political economy to think about how military organizations would try and build these institutions in this incredibly turbulent political environment. Um, and I would say that the new book, Age of Deception, right, takes the same idea and then raises it to the global level to look at the institutions that we build for knowledge, for communication, for control, for globalized commerce, for normal politics, right? And we come up with ways to subvert and exploit and usurp and co-opt these institutions. So that's really the main theme of the book, right? Cybersecurity as secret statecraft, right? It's not cybersecurity as war. It's not cyber warfare. It's cybersecurity as something other than war. And then the question is, what is that, right? And the book really focuses on this paradox of cooperating to compete, right? Or competing through cooperation, right? And it is the world historical success and cooperation that starts to enable a lot of competition. And maybe, I'll just sort of say as maybe a teaser for our conversation, when you think about the world historical breakdown of cooperation that we're all living through, right? The liberal order, if not dead, is at least going through, spasms and, intensive treatment. Hopefully, it's not in hospice; it'll come back. So we've got this dissolution of cooperation, and look at the news, right? Is it about cyber attacks and and cyber catastrophe? Yes, that's in the news, but what's really in the news is more anarchic warfare, large scale catastrophes in Gaza and Ukraine and Africa, right? So it's interesting that you start to see the weakening of institutions and you start to see a shift in conflict patterns back away from cyberspace to other places. Now, of course, they're happening in all places at all times, and we can certainly talk about that. Probably getting ahead of myself just a bit. Okay. So So to get a little more specific about what the book is about, I would say it tries to make four contributions. And the first one is trying to come up with a clear international relations idea of secret statecraft, right? So this is just coming up with some descriptive concepts for what has always been a really important part of politics, right? The old Chinese sage Sun Tzu writes a lot about war as a way of deception, and you can win without fighting, and there's five kinds of spies, right? So he's been thinking about that. There's an ancient Indian thinker named Kautilya who talks a lot about surveillance and counterintelligence forces to keep your state running. So this has been in the ether, but it really hasn't been theorized in international relations. And kind of my sort of just so story about this is that we've got great concepts about peace and governance and international law, right? So you think about John Locke talking about needing to make a commonwealth for the common good. And the theme there is you have institutions that we share that provide benefits for everybody. And then on the opposite extreme, right, you've got Karl von Clausewitz and all the other realists, right? And they tell us that we're in an anarchic world in which people will do politics by other means, namely warfare, and it's going to be hyper competitive and you're going to be afraid all the time. So this is a world in which there are no common institutions and lots of conflict and competition. So we've got these extremes. And then a funny thing happens in the 20th century, right? Funny, terrible, haha, right? Funny for security studies scholars, right? And that's the advent of nuclear weapons, right? And nuclear weapons, Bernard Brodie sees just 6 months after Hiroshima that these weapons are so big, so costly, and so destructive that they actually cannot be used in war. They'll destroy everything worth fighting for. And so what do you do, right? And he says, up until now, our militaries have existed to fight and win wars. From now on, they must exist to prevent them. That can be their only purpose. And so it's this irony of having the means of war in order to enable cooperation and stability. And Thomas Schelling is very explicit about this. He says, hey, you may not like coercion. Nobody likes threats. Nobody likes to have their livelihood put in jeopardy. But at the end of the day, coercion is about getting to yes. You're trying to find a cooperative deal that works for both sides rather than the outside option of fighting. So deterrence theory introduced this interesting set of paradoxes around using the means of war to achieve cooperation. Well, naturally, there's this other box, right? And that other box is what I call secret statecraft. And that's a box in which we have wonderful institutional means for cooperation, But now we've got ways to sneak into them, infiltrate them, subvert them. Maybe we are going to sabotage some bits and pieces. If we don't like people doing that to us, then we'll have secret police and counterintelligence services, and we'll run surveillance networks so that we can use deception against the deceivers. And it is this very contested, conflictual space that happens in the midst of these cooperative institutions. So it's as paradoxical as deterrence, but it's flipped on its head. It's the inverse. So that's kind of the idea of secret statecraft. And then, I talk about these, there's 4 different kinds of secret statecraft. There's espionage, which is sort of the purest form because you're not disrupting institutions, you're just stealing from them. Between espionage and normal governance, you have counterintelligence, which is using espionage but to reinforce institutions rather than degrade them. Between espionage and warfare, right? So a little less institutionalized, you have sabotage. And sabotage is breaking institutions. It's knocking people out of them, but it has to infiltrate in there first. And this is the intuition behind the idea in cyber that, hey, the same intrusion can be for espionage or for breaking things. And then in kind of in the middle, right, between espionage and deterrence, you've got subversion, and this is information operations, cyber-enabled disinformation and persuasion. And this is tricky because you're using deception and obfuscation, but you're also trying to send signals, and you're also trying to shape behavior. And it's very, very paradoxical to try and say something clearly and use secrecy and obfuscation to do it. Okay, and this is why it often doesn't work well. So secret statecraft, right, has these pure forms and then these others that are closer to it. So just typologically, it is this really, really interesting and generative part of the spectrum of political patterns. Okay, so that's the first goal, is to define secret statecraft not as a cyber thing, but as a general pattern of politics. And then the next goal, number 2, is to then drop down from the strategic political level to the operational level. Okay, and this is where the rubber hits the road. Okay, well, you want to infiltrate a society or an organization or a network. How do you actually do that? And we've got this big literature on military effectiveness. That was my first book, right? Where we talk about, like, what does it take to win on the battlefield? And do you need right organizations or doctrine? Is it all about technology? And so there's this huge literature on that. But there's not much on intelligence, right? Like, what does it take to spy effectively? Like, what does it mean to be, an effective saboteur? So I tried to create an operational theory, and this is sort of the main part of the book. To talk about what it takes to create persistent secret information channels. That's what I argue is the operational core of any intelligence operation in any era. Because you need to create that information channel. You can use that to pull information out or to push instructions and influence in. But it needs to exist. And because it takes a while to set up and you might want to use it in the future, it needs to persist. So you need to do that. Now, what does it take to do that? It's more than just military effectiveness. Military effectiveness really focuses on what one side is doing. Do I have the right organization? Do I have the right people? Do I have the right doctrine? Do I have the right set of equipment and material? And that's important, right? You need a spy organization, and you need capability, and you need the right kind of people and tradecraft. You need all of those things too, but those are the institutions you control. And what distinguishes intelligence from war is the shared institutional environment. So I argue that in addition to clandestine organization, you also need shared vulnerable institutions. And this is the place that, you are actually interacting with the target, the adversary, your colleague who you don't quite trust, right, in this shared institutional environment. And that provides connectivity so that you can access the target. And then the target also needs to have somehow weakened or flawed monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. And that allows you to have these extra degrees of freedom so that you can do a little extra on the side. Okay, so there's a theory of intelligence performance, right? It's got these 2 variables. Organization, you have it or you don't, right? Or institutions are vulnerable or they're not. And then, you get these different possibilities. If both are present, persistence is possible. If they're not, it's going to be really, really hard. If you've got a tough environment, but you've got a great organization, you might be able to run very complex organizations a la Stuxnet to like get in and do what you need to. If you've got a very vulnerable environment, but your organization is kind of disorganized or you're outsourcing to a lot of criminal networks, you're probably going to lose control of it. Okay, so we've kind of got these interesting degenerate things, and I'll say actually empirically, that's where most things end up is one of these two boxes. And that's partly because empirically, if you're looking at secret statecraft, you're looking at failure. Okay, you don't look at successes. The successes you never find out about. So things up in that the box where things are working are harder to find. Okay, secret statecraft, intelligence performance, and then the next thing, and I've been kind of been doing this already, is applying that to cyberspace. Okay, so we've been talking about kind of just general theory at the strategic and operational level. Let's think about how this applies to cyber, right? And this is now doing a little bit of work to say, hey, technology, yeah, it's material stuff and it's got infrastructure, but it's still institutional. And it's institutional in the kind of liberal political economy sense of, human-built constraints on human interaction. Right? That's kind of Douglas North's definition of institutions. And if it's human built, and if there are constraints, well, I don't think it really matters where the constraints live. Those constraints can be in norms and laws, but they can also exist in habits, and they can exist in software and infrastructure. And software is especially interesting because look at the language of software. It's files, folders, processes, registries, routines, programs, right? Software is literally rules, okay? It's literally an institution. Right? There's no way you can say it's not an institution. So it's constraining the behavior of not just human beings, but machines as well. So you've got institutions, excuse me, that are more digitized, and they are information and communication technologies at scale, now at global scale. So they are supersized. So you've got institutions that affect and touch all of us and constrain us to different degrees. We do so voluntarily, right? Again, we voluntarily constrain ourselves to spend time, on the same Zoom channel so that we can talk together. Okay, no one's imposing those on us. Interesting discussion to be had there. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of these, constraints are increasingly privatized. Okay, so you've got civilian actors that are building this infrastructure and are providing the security and exploitation services. And that's really, really interesting because we've got the same strategic and operational logics, but they are increasingly being conducted by civilian companies, civilian actors. And as well as militaries. Militaries and intelligence organizations are doing this, but they're also contracting through these civilian entities, and they are using them as proxies. Okay, and that of course creates these great fears that there's going to be large-scale disruption. So I would say that cyberspace and cybersecurity, it's still secret statecraft. You're still concerned about intelligence performance, but it's digitized, supersized, civilianized, and there's this threat of weaponization as well. Okay. Um, so lastly, the fourth one, and I can talk about this in Q&A if you want. It's a long book. It's got a bunch of empirical cases, and so that's another thing I wanted to do was sort of jump into some of the big cases and do a deep dive. The kind of work I like to do is a mix of kind of technical following what connects to what and what systems are being used and exploited, and political and social institutional analysis. So there are cases of espionage, subversion, sabotage, security, and an attempt to bring them all together. So I start with Bletchley Park, right? So this is a book not just on cybersecurity, but I love Bletchley Park because it's kind of the beginning of cyberspace. It's the first time you've got machine versus machine with code-breaking machines and encryption machines. Some of those code-breaking machines are quite literally digital, right? So Colossus is the first electronic machine, and it's used to break the teleprinter code that the Germans put together, the Lawrence machine. You've got all of these mathematicians and engineers that are working together. They are breaking codes at scale. So already you see the glimmerings of the digitization, the supersizing, and the civilianization of intelligence operations at Bletchley Park. The next case is I spent some time with everybody's favorite cyber hobby horse, Stuxnet, which I've written on, but I'm revisiting it. And when I wrote on it the first time back in 2013, this was sort of my first foray into thinking about cyber. I looked at it as warfare and I criticized it as warfare. I said, warfare is not really, cyber can't really do very much. Now I look back and say, well, this was never warfare at all. It was always secret statecraft. And when you look at it as secret statecraft, it gets really interesting, right? It's actually not just this one thing that happens in a 1 year span of time. It's a 15-year long set of interlinked campaigns with multiple actors, right? And while it fails to degrade the Iranian nuclear program in any meaningful way, right? Enrichment continues the entire time. It is very successful as a form of secret diplomacy for the United States to dissuade Israel at the time from bombing Iran, right? They eventually got around to that, but at the time, right, as a secret diplomacy measure between the United States and Israel, it was successful. So this is very interesting, and sure enough, the conditions are very, very mixed, right? This is a very difficult environment, but a very sophisticated organization. But when you started to see rifts in the organization, that's when they started to introduce problems that made the operation break down. Okay. I spent some time on the 2016 election, which is kind of the other condition, super permissive environment, but the Russians are all over the place. It's a very conflicted environment. The Americans are creating far more disinformation than the Russians could ever imagine. And that's really the theme of this is that, we did it to ourselves, right? Americans elected President Trump, right? The Russians were sort of just a sideshow. If anything, they're symptomatic of it, right? And that's an interesting case because this is a book about deception. And that was happening out in the open, right? I mean, Russia was attributed pretty quickly. And once they were attributed, right, things went into high gear because domestic actors in the United States seized on that and started amplifying the signal. And what was so fascinating in 2016 and has gotten more intense in American politics is disinformation is used as a political signal because those who repeat it show that they are on Team MAGA, and those who try and suppress it and fact check it show that they are on Team Liberal Internationalism. Okay. And so it becomes less about the truth and more about sorting which side of this divide that you're on. Now, not everybody may see it that way, but this is how you kind of explain this puzzle of how is it that something that starts off as secret, starts off as disinformation, can enter this situation where everybody knows that it's fake. And I would argue that it is kind of exited the realm of pure secret statecraft, and it's now in that middle subversion tending towards open normal politics, where you actually are using signals to credibly separate people into different factions. Okay. Um, then there's a whole chapter on China, which is very complex, where I put all of these together and talk about the grand strategic level. If you want to talk about that, we can. But I've been talking for a while. So let me conclude by just saying, the book, right, tries to explode these myths of cyber war. I've been doing that for a while. So, let's talk about this in a different way. It tries to not just be negative and cranky, but provide a positive story of, if not war, what is it useful for? And the answer is secret statecraft, right? Cyber is a form of intelligence, even if it's conducted by military organizations. And I would say when militaries say that they're doing cyber warfare, they're really doing intelligence competition. And this is a story more of intelligence becoming more relevant in war, information becoming more relevant in war, therefore creating a larger space. So it's not surprising that the intelligence parts of militaries have been growing. That's why I look at Bletchley Park and this goes on. And that was a big theme in my first book too, right? More information means more information friction, and this is just a way of deliberately doing that. And then finally, right, is sort of just the irony of institutionalism, right? And over the past 10 years, both theoretically and unfortunately practically, right, we've all been talking about the weaponization of interdependence. We've been talking about networked authoritarianism. We've been talking about ways in which institutions don't just provide, cooperation, collaboration, and public goods, but enable really, really ruthless competition. So this definitely contributes to that. And that's it's a mixed story. On one hand, like, okay, you're doing cyber competition rather than real warfare. That's good. But the price is degraded human security. The price is more intensive internal conflicts. The price is more counterintelligence and surveillance, which makes sense, right? Because the whole argument is you depend on institutions, which makes you think that cyber competition is going to be more relevant within institutions than across them. So that's why I think, the real story is on kind of internal security and institutional contestation rather than thinking about classic politics in anarchy. Okay. Well, my short introduction turned out to be very, very long. So there it is. I'll just be quiet now, and I'd love to hear any questions.